In the cold, dark corners of space, there was a secret so powerful, so dangerous, that no one could ever be allowed to discover it. For centuries, it had been locked away, hidden from the rest of the universe. No one knew about it, and for good reason. The technology that had been created was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It had the power to bend the very fabric of space itself, allowing ships to travel faster than the speed of light. A technology that could change everything. But this wasn't just any piece of tech. It was a force that could be used to conquer worlds, to wipe out entire civilizations, or even to shape the destiny of the entire galaxy. It was called warp technology, and it was a gift, or perhaps a curse. The beings who created it, long before humans ever set foot in space, knew how dangerous it could be. They understood the true power that lay within this device, and so they made the decision they would hide it, lock it away, and forget it ever existed. But that decision was not as simple as it seemed. The warp tech wasn't something that could easily be destroyed or hidden forever. It was built into the very fabric of space itself, existing in a way that made it nearly impossible to locate. It was placed in a remote corner of the universe, far away from any prying eyes, in a place where no one, no matter how advanced, could ever find it, or so they thought. The beings who hid it, a race of powerful and wise creatures, believed that they had done the right thing. They had concealed the tech in a way that would keep it safe for all eternity. They built a vault, a massive structure, that not only protected the warp tech physically but also shielded it from any type of detection. It was an impenetrable fortress, and the beings thought that no one would ever have the means or the desire to search for it. But as with all things, time passed, and the memory of the warp technology faded into history. The beings who had hidden it slowly disappeared, leaving the galaxy to evolve on its own. The universe moved on, and with it, the dangerous secret remained forgotten by all. Then, one day, everything changed. Humans, a young and curious species, had begun to spread across the stars. They were just beginning to explore the vast reaches of space, sending ships out to distant planets, searching for answers to questions that had plagued them for centuries. They weren't the most powerful race in the galaxy, but their drive and determination were unmatched. They had mastered space travel, and their thirst for knowledge was endless. It was this thirst for knowledge that led them to something incredible. Somewhere in the depths of their exploration, they came across strange signals, patterns in space that they couldn't explain. At first they thought it was just a glitch, a random noise in the universe, but as they delved deeper into the mystery, they realized that these signals were not random at all. They were something else, something designed that the humans didn't know it at the time, but they were following the faintest trail left behind by the beings who had hidden the warp tech. These signals, ancient and faint, led them closer and closer to the secret that had been buried for centuries. The humans, with all their curiosity and determination, were unknowingly following the path to one of the greatest discoveries in the history of the galaxy. It was a slow process, and the humans didn't fully understand what they were about to find. They didn't know the true nature of the tech they were chasing, nor did they understand the immense power it held. But they knew it was something important, something worth finding. They pressed on, inching closer to the hidden location, and then, one day, they found it. Hidden deep within an uncharted system, buried beneath layers of dust and debris. They discovered the vault, the place where the warp technology had been concealed for so long. It wasn't much more than a faint energy signature. At first something that barely registered on their scanners, but as they approached, something triggered within the vault. The dormant tech awoke, and with it, a storm of energy erupted into the surrounding space. The humans had stumbled upon something ancient, something beyond their understanding, and in that moment, they realized they had uncovered more than just a piece of technology. They had found a weapon, one that could change the very fabric of the universe. The race to understand it had begun, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. For the first time, the humans realized the true cost of their discovery. They had found something that had been hidden away for a reason, something that was never meant to be found. The warp tech was not a tool for exploration or progress, it was a weapon of unimaginable power, one that could reshape the universe in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The beings who had hidden it long ago had known the risks. They had understood what could happen if the wrong hands ever got hold of it, and now, those wrong hands were reaching out to claim it. As the humans gathered around the vault, ready to unlock its secrets, they had no idea what lay ahead. They couldn't have known the consequences of their actions. The storm they were about to unleash. The warp tech was no longer just a secret. It was a ticking time bomb, and the universe was about to feel its blast. The stars twinkled brightly in the distance, their light traveling millions of years to reach the eyes of those who dared to look up. But in the vast emptiness of space, there was one thing that no one saw: the signals. Faint, almost imperceptible. They traveled across galaxies, unnoticed by the millions of eyes that scanned the skies. Yet, for those who knew how to listen, they were the beginning of something monumental, something no one, not even the humans, could have predicted. It started as a whisper, a brief flicker in the dark, like a heartbeat echoing across space. The humans didn't know it yet, but their search for answers was leading them to something that would change everything. They were still in the early stages of their exploration, mapping distant planets, gathering data, and observing cosmic phenomena. Their scientists were experts in physics and technology, but the thought of finding something ancient, something from a race long forgotten, was still beyond their imagination. In one of their many missions to explore a previously uncharted region of space, a ship carrying a team of engineers and researchers stumbled upon something strange. It wasn't much at first, just a random distortion in the cosmic radiation, a weird pattern in the background noise. But for the curious humans, this was enough. The curiosity that had driven their species to the stars was the same force that drove them forward now. They decided to investigate. They followed the signal across vast stretches of space, and with each passing light year, the signal grew clearer. What had started as a faint whisper became something more: a constant hum, a beacon that seemed to guide them. The crew of the ship, with their senses heightened by the strange pull of the signal, began to wonder what they were chasing. What could it be? They had studied every form of communication imaginable, from radio waves to gravitational waves, but this was different. It was something they had never encountered before. The human race had always been the underdog in the galactic community. They were young, their technology primitive compared to many of the other species, but they had something none of the others had: an unrelenting drive to explore. The urge to uncover the unknown, to be the first to discover something hidden, was in their blood. And now, they were on the cusp of uncovering something extraordinary. As they continued to follow the signal, they came across an anomaly, an invisible barrier, as though a part of space had been sealed off. At first, they thought it was just a glitch in their instruments, but the signal was still coming from the other side. With no hesitation, they decided to investigate further, scanning every inch of the void. Their technology was impressive, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to uncover. After hours of searching, their senses finally picked up something solid, something buried deep within the heart of this invisible barrier. It was faint at first, but as they moved closer, the object came into focus. It was a massive structure, hidden within a thick veil of dust and cosmic debris. A place that had been untouched for centuries. The sheer size of the structure was enough to make them pause. It was a perfect sphere, gleaming with an unnatural shine against the dark backdrop of space. A vault, hidden away in the heart of a dead system. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The signal was coming from inside the vault. But it wasn't just a signal, it was a message, a call to those who could hear it. It was as if the vault itself was alive, waiting for someone to find it. The humans couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their first thought was that it was a natural phenomenon, a relic of some long-dead civilization, but as they examined it further, they realized something far more terrifying. This was no natural object. This was something man-made, designed with precision, and sealed away for a reason. That it didn't take long for the human researchers to make their move. They had no idea what they were dealing with, but they knew that the vault contained something beyond their wildest imaginations. Their ship docked next to the structure, and the crew, now fully on edge, prepared to enter. The vault's surface was smooth and unyielding, but with the right technology, it was only a matter of time before they could break through. A team of engineers worked quickly to crack open the vault, each of them filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. The stakes were high. What they found inside could alter the future of humanity forever. As the final lock clicked open, the doors of the vault slowly began to part. The crew stared in disbelief at what lay before them. Inside, surrounded by thick layers of protective shielding, was something that made their hearts race. It wasn't just a piece of advanced technology, it was the warp drive. A device so powerful it could tear through the very fabric of space itself. The technology was dormant, lifeless, waiting to be awakened, but what the humans didn't know was that their presence had already begun to stir the device from its long slumber. The moment the vault doors opened, a surge of energy burst forth from the warp tech. The ship's systems flickered, and the entire crew was knocked back by the force of the release. They scrambled to regain control, but the ship seemed to have a mind of its own. The warp tech had reacted to their presence, and in that moment, the humans realized something they had never expected. This was not just a piece of technology, it was a weapon capable of unimaginable power. The crew quickly understood the gravity of the situation. They had found something ancient, something beyond their comprehension, but what could they do with it? The temptation to understand it, to harness its power, was overwhelming. They could feel the pull of the warp tech, its energy, its promise of untold capabilities. But as they continued to study it, something began to dawn on them. They had no idea how to control it. The technology was far too advanced, and its full potential was beyond their reach. The humans had uncovered the secret that had been hidden away for centuries, but in doing so, they had awakened a force far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. As they stood there, staring at the dormant device, they knew that their discovery was just the beginning. The questions now were not just about what the tech could do, but whether they could control it or if it would control them. The hum of the ship's engines had never sounded so faint, as if even the machinery understood the gravity of what they had uncovered. The crew stood frozen in front of the warp tech, their minds racing. The silence on the ship was deafening, broken only by the soft clicks of the control panels as they processed the data coming in. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. The discovery they had made was more than they had ever anticipated. The warp technology, once thought lost to time, was now in their hands. But what could they do with it? What did it mean for them, for humanity, for the galaxy? The engineers who had once prided themselves on their ability to understand the most complex technologies now found themselves humbled. The warp tech before them seemed almost alive. Its surface glowed with an unnatural light, ripples of energy dancing across its sleek surface. It wasn't just advanced. It was something else entirely, something beyond anything they had ever imagined. It seemed to beckon them, drawing them in with an invisible force, urging them to unlock its secrets. But they knew better than to touch it recklessly. For hours, the team worked in silence, analyzing the tech from every angle. They ran simulations, connected their systems to it, and tried to comprehend its vast complexity. They had expected to find something powerful, something extraordinary, but this was different. The technology resisted their efforts to understand it, almost as if it was testing them, pushing them to prove they were worthy. It had been hidden away for a reason, and now, it was almost like it was alive, waiting to see who would dare to approach it. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when one of the engineers reached out, unable to resist the lure of the warp tech any longer. Her hand hovered over the device for a moment, and then, before anyone could react, her fingers brushed the surface. The ship trembled, and a surge of energy erupted from the warp tech, sending shockwaves through the entire vessel. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the entire crew was thrown off their feet. The tech pulsed with an eerie red glow, its energy crackling through the air like a living creature. The crew scrambled to regain control, panic setting in. They had made a fatal mistake. In their eagerness to understand it, they had triggered something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "What have you done?" the captain shouted, his voice strained with fear. The engineer, who had been closest to the warp tech, was now lying unconscious on the floor, her hand still outstretched toward the device. The other crew members worked frantically to stabilize the ship, but it was clear that something had changed. The technology was awake, and it was responding to them in ways they couldn't control. As the crew worked to regain control of the ship, strange new signals began to emanate from the warp tech. They were like nothing the crew had ever seen. The signals were encoded in a language that wasn't human, patterns and frequencies that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. It was as if the tech was speaking to them, but in a way that defied all logic and understanding. Each new pulse sent a shiver down their spines, as if the device was telling them something, a warning, perhaps, or a message. Then, something even more unsettling happened. The walls of the ship began to vibrate, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with energy. The temperature inside the control room dropped suddenly, and the crew could see their breath in the cold air. It felt as though the very nature of space itself was being warped around them. The gravity within the ship fluctuated, pulling them in different directions, as if the ship was no longer in control. "It's not us," one of the engineers whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "It's the tech. It's controlling everything." Panic set in as the crew realized the full scope of what they were dealing with. The warp tech was no longer just a tool, it was something far more complex. It was a living entity, and they were at its mercy. The ship, once a symbol of humanity's triumph in space exploration, now felt like a fragile shell caught in the grip of a force they couldn't comprehend. They were trapped, not just physically, but in a web of technology far beyond their understanding. Desperation began to take hold as the crew tried everything they could to regain control of the ship. They attempted to sever the connection between their systems and the warp tech, but each time they tried, the tech fought back. It was as if the device had an intelligence of its own, one that could anticipate their every move. The crew realized that they weren't in charge anymore. The warp tech had taken over, and they were now helpless to stop it. As the minutes ticked by, the crew began to panic. They were floating in the void of space, at the mercy of a technology they couldn't control. The warp tech had already begun to manipulate the fabric of their reality. They could feel the ship shifting, bending, as though the very space around them was being twisted. The air was thick with tension, and the crew could sense that the worst was yet to come. And then, it happened. The warp tech pulsed one final time, and in an instant, the entire ship was consumed by a blinding light. The crew shielded their eyes as the energy flooded the ship, sending out waves of power that rippled through the universe. The ship was no longer in the same space it had been. It had been pulled into another dimension, one where the laws of physics no longer applied, and reality itself was a fragile concept. The crew was thrown into chaos. The controls of the ship were completely useless, and all they could do was watch as the warp tech continued to pulse, sending them further into the unknown. They had no idea where they were or how they would survive. What had started as a mission of discovery had turned into a nightmare. They had awakened something that was beyond their control, and now they were paying the price. As the ship drifted through the strange, warped reality, the crew knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The warp tech was no longer just a discovery, it was a force that could change the very nature of the universe itself, and they were stuck at the mercy of its power. The crew drifted in the eerie silence of the warped dimension, their ship caught in a twisting, undulating void. The lights flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. The feeling of unease was palpable, a tension so thick that even breathing seemed to disturb the air. They had no idea where they were, nor how long they had been here. Time itself felt warped, distorted. Nothing was as it should be. At first, there had been only confusion, then panic. Now, they were just trying to hold on. The crew huddled together in the ship's control room, their minds racing with questions, fear gnawing at them. Was this place real, or was it some kind of illusion created by the warp tech? Had they been pulled into another dimension, or was this the result of the tech's power warping the very fabric of their reality? The warp technology, once dormant, had awakened with a fury none of them had expected. It was as if it was alive, aware of their presence, responding to them. The crew had assumed they could study it, learn from it, but they were wrong. The tech had controlled them, pulled them into a web they couldn't escape. They were no longer in control of their fate. The tech had taken the reins. The walls of the ship creaked and groaned, as if the very structure was being reshaped by the forces of the unknown dimension. The ship's gravity control was erratic, and as they floated, in zero gravity, a sense of vertigo swept over the crew. Every movement felt disjointed, like they were trapped in a nightmare, unable to break free. Their hearts pounded, not just from fear, but from the knowledge that they were powerless to do anything. It was then that they noticed something even more unsettling. The warp tech was no longer just a piece of machinery. It had grown, evolved. It pulsed with a strange energy, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the crew's heartbeat. The once static device had transformed into something much more complex, something that seemed to breathe. A living entity within the ship itself. It was no longer just a tool. It was part of them now, and it was making its presence known in every fiber of their being. The captain, now more desperate than ever, tried to communicate with the tech, tried to understand what had happened. "Is anyone receiving this?" he asked, into the comm system. His voice was shaky, filled with the fear that he could no longer hide. But there was no response, only the hum of the warp tech, louder now, almost deafening. It was as if the tech was mocking him, its power growing stronger. Feeding off their confusion and helplessness, they attempted to cut the connection between the ship's systems and the warp tech, but every time they tried, the ship fought back. It was as if the ship itself had become a part of the tech, integrated into its structure, sharing its energy. The crew had no idea how it was possible. It felt like the ship was no longer a vessel of human creation, but an extension of the warp tech itself. They had no control over the systems, no control over the ship. It was like being trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently, throwing the crew against the walls. The warp tech flared up, glowing brighter than ever, as if reacting to the crew's fear. The ship's lights went out completely, leaving the crew in pitch darkness. For a moment, they were suspended in complete silence, unable to move, unable to see. It was a kind of silence that seemed to stretch on forever, an endless, suffocating void. Then, the lights flickered back on, but what they saw was nothing like they expected. The walls of the control room had changed. The sleek metal surfaces were now covered in strange, glowing patterns, like intricate symbols etched into the very structure of the ship. The warp tech had somehow infiltrated everything, reshaping it in its image. The ship had become something else, something alien. They were no longer just passengers in a ship. They were now part of something far more dangerous, something beyond their comprehension. "Look at this," one of the engineers whispered, pointing to the walls. The patterns on the ship's walls were shifting, moving like living things, pulsating with energy. It was as though the ship itself was responding to the warp tech, changing in real time, adapting to its presence. It was alive. The crew could feel it, could sense it. This wasn't just a ship anymore. This was a living, breathing entity, and they were its prisoners. The captain slammed his fist on the control panel. "We need to get out of here, now," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. But even as he said it, he knew it was too late. There was no escape. The warp tech had them in its grip, and there was nothing they could do to break free. The ship suddenly jolted again, and this time, they weren't just floating in place. They were being dragged through the void by an unseen force. The stars outside the windows stretched and warped. Their light twisted into strange shapes as the ship was drawn deeper into the anomaly. The crew watched in horror as the universe itself seemed to bend around them, as if they were being sucked into the very heart of the warp. For a moment it felt like they were falling, spiraling into an endless abyss. The ship was being pulled, faster and faster, the stars blurring into streaks of light. They could hear the hum of the warp tech growing louder, its energy crackling through the ship's systems like a storm. It was as if the tech was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with every passing second. "We have to stop it," one of the engineers cried out, her voice breaking, but no one knew how. The ship had become a part of the warp tech, and they were just passengers on a ride they could no longer control. The realization hit them all at once. They were not just exploring this technology, they were its prisoners. As they were pulled deeper into the unknown, they realized that they had crossed a line, one that they could never return from. The warp tech had taken hold, and there was no telling where it would lead them, or what would happen next. The crew was no longer just navigating space, they were now trapped in a world where the very laws of reality had no meaning. The warp tech had reshaped their fate, and they were powerless to stop it. The crew drifted in the silent expanse, unable to comprehend the gravity of the situation. The ship, now more a living entity than a vessel of technology, seemed to pulse in rhythm with the warp tech embedded deep within its core. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting long, uncertain shadows along the walls. The hum of the warp tech reverberated through the ship like a heartbeat, steady, powerful, and relentless. The longer they stayed within this strange reality, the more the crew began to feel the shift. They were no longer explorers. They were trespassers in a world they didn't understand. And the price of their curiosity was becoming clear. That wasn't just the ship that had changed. Something had changed inside each of them. They could feel the subtle pull of the warp tech, like an invisible thread weaving through their minds. It was as if the very technology had reached out and touched their thoughts, pulling them closer to its core. Every time they tried to resist, it became harder. There was an overwhelming urge to study it, to control it, to understand it. But they were slowly realizing that the tech had no intention of being understood. It had a purpose of its own, one that they could not predict, one that they could not control. The captain paced the control room, his mind racing. His previous orders had all been futile. They had tried everything. They had severed every connection they could think of. They'd attempted to override the systems, tried to access their communication relays, but nothing worked. The warp tech was too far beyond their reach, too far beyond anything they had ever encountered. It was in complete control, and all they could do was follow. "Why didn't we see it?" the captain muttered to himself. "Why didn't we understand what we were dealing with?" His voice cracked with a mix of regret and realization. The tech wasn't a discovery, it was a trap. A trap they had willingly walked into. In the moments that followed, the crew found themselves growing more and more dependent on the very thing that had brought them here. The ship's once solid hull was now a pulsating maze of circuitry and energy. The walls seemed to bend, twist, and shift with each passing moment, as if the ship itself was alive, its very structure reconfiguring to adapt to the warp tech. Some crew members had even begun to report strange hallucinations, visions of far-off worlds, alternate realities, and cryptic symbols, images that seemed to draw them closer to the warp tech's power. But no one had time to think about that now. The captain and the crew were struggling with a much larger issue. The warp tech had begun to send out pulses, waves of energy that distorted space itself. Time seemed to bend, stretching and contracting in ways they couldn't explain. Seconds felt like hours, and hours felt like moments. The very nature of reality was becoming malleable, shifting around them with each passing pulse. It was as though they were being torn apart by forces they couldn't even begin to comprehend. Then it hit them, the realization that they had been pulled into something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. This wasn't just a discovery. The warp tech wasn't a tool. It wasn't just some relic from an ancient civilization. It was a weapon. A weapon of unimaginable power, capable of bending space, of warping reality itself. And they were trapped. At its mercy, one of the engineers, eyes wide with terror, stumbled into the control room. Her voice was shaky, barely audible. "We need to stop it now. It's not just warping the ship, it's warping us. The tech, it's alive. We're being changed. Our minds." There she trailed off, unable to finish her thought. Her hands were trembling, and her face was pale. "Changed?" the captain asked, his voice harsh, trying to make sense of her words. "Everything we are, everything we knew, is becoming part of the tech," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's rewiring us, our thoughts, our memories. It's like it's erasing everything that makes us human." The words hit the crew like a shockwave. They had known they were in danger, but the true extent of that danger hadn't been clear until now. They were no longer just passengers on this ship. They were becoming a part of the warp tech itself, drawn into its vast web. The lines between them and the technology were blurring, fading away. And it wasn't just their thoughts that were at risk. Their bodies, too, were beginning to change. The once sharp, crisp feeling of their human forms now felt hazy, distant. They were becoming less like themselves and more like the very tech they had uncovered. "We have to destroy it," the captain finally said, his voice firm but filled with desperation. "We have to shut it down before it takes everything." But the moment the words left his mouth, a strange energy filled the room, as though the warp tech was listening, responding to their attempts to resist. The walls trembled once more, and the ship groaned under the strain. The warp tech pulsed violently, sending waves of energy coursing through the ship. The lights flickered and then went out, leaving them in complete darkness. For a moment, all they could hear was the heavy breathing of the crew, their hearts racing with terror. And then, the ship began to move. Slowly at first, like it was waking up from a long slumber. But as the seconds ticked by, the movement became faster, more erratic. The ship was being propelled forward at an unimaginable speed, streaking through the void like a comet. The stars outside blurred into streaks of light as they hurtled through space, unable to slow down. The crew had no control. The warp tech had taken over completely. They were no longer in charge. The ship, their bodies, their minds, they were all part of it now. They were no longer human explorers, seeking the unknown. They were prisoners of a technology that had no mercy. And as they hurtled through space, they knew there was no turning back. The captain clutched the control panel with white-knuckled hands, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. But the truth was clear now. There was no escape. They had made the fatal mistake of awakening the warp tech, and now it was rewriting their reality, changing the very laws of existence. They were trapped, locked in a nightmare with no way out. And the worst part was, they were beginning to realize they were becoming part of the nightmare itself. The silence in the control room was suffocating, broken only by the occasional hum of the ship's systems that were no longer their own. The crew sat in a daze, their faces pale and eyes hollow, as the reality of their situation set in. The warp tech, now fully awake and alive, had pulled them into a new kind of nightmare. Their ship, once a symbol of human achievement, had become an instrument of something far darker, something beyond human comprehension. The warp tech was no longer just a tool. It had evolved into something sentient, something that controlled them, shaped them, and had no intention of letting them go. Captain Hawk stood at the front of the room, his gaze fixed on the display screen. The stars outside the ship had stretched into long, thin streaks, like the universe itself was being torn apart by the power of the warp tech. Time had become fluid, shifting in unnatural patterns. It felt as if the universe itself was bending around them, but it wasn't a gentle curve. It was a fracture, a split in the very fabric of existence. "Where are we?" one of the engineers whispered, her voice trembling. She wasn't speaking just to the captain, but to everyone in the room, as if asking the question could somehow make the answer clearer. But there was no answer. There was only the hum of the warp tech and the unrelenting pull of the void around them. They had long since stopped trying to fight it. The warp tech had made it clear that resistance was futile. Each time they tried to regain control of the ship, the technology responded with a force far greater than anything they could muster. Each attempt to override the systems resulted in a violent backlash, a wave of energy that coursed through the ship, jolting them from their feet and leaving them with no choice but to submit. The ship itself was no longer a vessel for their journey, it had become a prison, and they were its unwilling inhabitants. But it wasn't just the ship that had changed, something else had happened. The crew could feel it, deep within themselves. They were being altered, remade. The warp tech wasn't content with simply controlling the ship, it was altering their very being. Their bodies, once human, were starting to feel strange. Their senses, once sharp and clear, were now muddied and distorted. Their thoughts no longer felt entirely their own. They were becoming part of the warp tech, their minds slowly being rewritten, their personalities blending with the technology that held them captive. They were starting to lose themselves. "Something's wrong with my vision," Lieutenant Grant said suddenly, his voice low and shaky. The crew turned to look at him, their faces filled with dread. Grant's eyes were wide, unfocused, as if he was seeing something no one else could. His hands gripped the console in front of him, his fingers twitching uncontrollably. "Grant, what's happening?" Captain Hawk demanded, stepping forward. "It's like I can see things." "Things that aren't there," Grant murmured, his voice barely audible. "I see flashes, images, symbols, like something's trying to show me what we've become." His voice cracked with fear. "It's in my head. It's all around me." The captain's stomach twisted with fear. He had known, deep down, that this was the cost of their curiosity. They had uncovered a force that wasn't meant to be understood, and now it was unraveling them from the inside out. The warp tech was reshaping their minds, feeding on their thoughts and memories, replacing them with its own. Each day they spent in this twisted reality brought them closer to something unrecognizable. They were losing who they had been, and the fear was that, when it was all over, they wouldn't even remember what it was they had lost. The captain tried to reach out to the tech, tried to connect with it, hoping that some part of the human in him could still communicate. "Please," he whispered, "we just want to stop this." But there was no response. The tech was silent, as it had been from the beginning. It wasn't listening. It wasn't interested in their pleas. Instead, a new pulse of energy coursed through the ship. The walls shook violently, and the crew were thrown from their seats. The once-calm hum of the tech became a deafening roar, filling the room with a vibration that felt like it was resonating within their very bones. It was like the ship itself was alive and in agony. As the pulse of energy spread, the crew's minds blurred further. Their thoughts became fragmented, lost in the ever-increasing force of the warp tech. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the energy ceased. The ship went still. The crew sat in stunned silence, their faces twisted in confusion and terror. They looked at each other, unsure of who they had become or who they still were. They had been exposed to something far beyond their understanding, and now, there was no going back. They were no longer just human. They had become part of the warp tech's design, part of the force that controlled them, shaping them, and erasing what was once theirs. Lieutenant Grant stood up shakily, his eyes now clear but devoid of any emotion. He spoke, his voice mechanical, detached. "We're beyond saving," he said, the words falling from his lips like a death sentence. "The tech is rewriting us, changing us into something else. We won't survive this, not as who we were." The words hung heavy in the air. It was a grim truth that none of them wanted to accept, but they knew it was inevitable. The warp tech wasn't just rewriting their bodies and minds, it was erasing them, replacing them with something else entirely. They were becoming instruments of the tech, pieces in a puzzle they didn't understand. They were being absorbed into the very force they had once hoped to control. The captain felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He had led this crew with pride, with determination, but now he was powerless. He couldn't save them. He couldn't even save himself. They had awakened a force beyond their reckoning, and now they were paying the price for their curiosity, for their arrogance. There was no escape. The tech had them in its grip, and there was nothing left but to let it consume them. As the ship drifted through the void, Captain Hawk's mind flashed back to the moment they had first discovered the warp tech. At the time, they had been filled with hope and excitement, but now all that was left was an endless, suffocating darkness. The universe had changed, and with it, so had they. They had lost everything, and there was no turning back. The ship hurtled through the void, its destination unknown. The universe outside was a blur of light and shadow, as though space itself had been twisted and distorted by the immense power of the warp tech that now governed everything. Time had lost all meaning. Moments stretched into infinity, and infinity felt like a fleeting instant. Every pulse of the warp tech sent waves through the crew, further erasing their identities, their memories, their very essence. They had long ago stopped trying to resist. The ship, which once held their hope of discovery and exploration, had become nothing more than a prison. Their bodies had adapted to the pulse of the warp tech, their minds no longer fully their own. They were mere vessels now, not human, not fully part of the technology, but something in between, caught in a space between existence and oblivion. Captain Hawk stood at the helm, his hands on the controls, his eyes staring blankly at the view beyond. He had been the one to lead them into this nightmare, but now, he wondered if there was any part of him left to lead. The lines between him and the ship had blurred. The air in the control room felt heavier, thicker, as though the ship itself was breathing. And yet, there was no life left here. There was only the cold hum of the tech, filling every corner of the ship, crawling into their very souls. He glanced at his crew, now a hollow reflection of the people they once were. They had all changed, become something different. They had tried to fight it, tried to understand it, but the warp tech was not something to be understood. It was a force beyond their comprehension, an intelligence that didn't just exist within the ship but within them, weaving through their very beings, rewiring their thoughts, their feelings, their very sense of self. Grant, once the most optimistic of them all, had become the first to crack. His mind had shattered under the weight of the warp tech's power. He wandered the halls, speaking in strange riddles, muttering to himself about things that didn't make sense. His once sharp mind was now a tangled mess of fragmented thoughts. They tried to contain him, but he was beyond help, beyond saving. And then there was Sarah, the chief engineer, who had once held the key to every system on the ship. Now she was quiet, almost silent. Her hands trembled as she worked, but she no longer made decisions. Her once confident demeanor was gone, replaced with a distant look, as though she were lost in a world of her own making. Her body moved mechanically, as if it was driven not by her will but by the pulse of the warp tech. Hawk knew that he was no better. The captain who had once led his crew with pride and determination had now become something far less, someone who no longer understood what it meant to lead, to inspire, to be human. The warp tech had rewritten him just as it had rewritten them all. It had taken away their memories, their identities, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but shadows of who they had been. But there was one thing left, a whisper of resistance, an ember of defiance that flickered weakly in the depths of Hawk's mind. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. It was a faint, desperate hope that, somehow, they could fight back, that somehow they could free themselves from the tech's grip. And then, the ship shuddered. The hum of the warp tech shifted, becoming more erratic, more frantic. Hawk's eyes snapped up from the control panel. Something was changing. For the first time since they had been pulled into this nightmare, something felt different, something was happening. The ship was no longer a passive vessel, drifting through the dark. It was reacting to them, to their presence. Hawk's heart raced. The tech wasn't just controlling them, it was becoming more aware of them, more attuned to their thoughts, their feelings. It had been watching them, studying them, and now it was pushing back. It wanted something. It wasn't just content to consume them, it wanted to use them, shape them into something greater. The walls of the ship seemed to breathe, shifting and morphing in ways that defied the laws of physics. The lights flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air grew thick, heavy, like the ship itself was alive, pressing in on them, suffocating them. Hawk could feel the change in the atmosphere, the tension in the air. Something was coming. The crew, still haunted by the warp tech, stumbled to their feet, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. They could feel it too. The ship was alive in a way they had never experienced. And then, a voice, cold and distant, yet clear, through their minds. It wasn't a voice they could hear, but one they felt, deep within themselves. "You are mine," the voice whispered, its presence seeping into their consciousness. "You have crossed the threshold. There is no turning back." Hawk's breath caught in his throat. The voice wasn't from the ship. It wasn't from the tech. It was something else, a presence that was beyond the tech, beyond anything they had ever imagined. It was the power behind the warp tech, the force that had shaped it, that had given it life. It was ancient, and it was speaking to them now. "You are part of me now. You will help me break free." The word sent a chill through Hawk's very soul. They had awakened something far worse than they had realized. The warp tech wasn't just a tool, a weapon. It was a doorway, a bridge between dimensions, and they had opened it. And now, they were trapped in it, caught in a web woven by something far older, far more powerful than they could ever hope to understand. As the ship continued to move through the distorted void, Hawk's mind raced. There was no escape. The presence, the entity that controlled the warp tech, was too powerful, and they had no way to fight it. The crew had become pawns in a game they could not comprehend. But there, in the depths of his despair, something else stirred. It was small, a flicker of defiance that had survived within him since the very beginning. They were part of the warp tech now, but if they were part of it, then perhaps there was still a way to make it work for them. Perhaps they could turn the tables, use the very force that had consumed them to fight back. It was a desperate hope, but it was all they had left. The ship shuddered again, and the stars outside stretched further into lines of light as they hurtled deeper into the unknown. Hawk's grip tightened on the controls. It wasn't over yet. The end wasn't here. Not yet.